It has been so long since I've done an album review, I can't even remember how I used to do them. I think I started this top 10 most important albums to me, but I don't even remember what I called it. I should have looked at the playlist. My top 10 albums, I think I started that like a year ago, and I was hoping to have it done within a couple months, because I thought, oh, I'll just do a new one every week. And then for so many reasons, it just hasn't happened. So here's number 9, which means there's only one left after. So, cool. This is a Perfect Circles debut album. I'm going to butcher the French. I'm going to say MER de Noms, which is Sea of Names, is the translation that I am aware of anyway. And came out in the year 2000. So, it came out in the year 2000, but I didn't hear about it. 2002, I would say, is probably the earliest, but it was probably more likely 2003, 2004, and because it's relevant to date myself, I would say I was about 16, 17 when the album was introduced to me. So there was an acquaintance from school that I barely started talking to, that I didn't really have a lot of connection with, but somehow we just started talking a little bit and realized that there's a little bit of, I don't know, it was a weird scenario because it was such a small school, and I don't know, I think that my tastes in music and things were very well known because they were, for the most part, and the way that I expressed myself really linked to that, and they were just way over here, and almost everyone else was way over here, and so I don't know how. But she lent me this album. I think there were only 2 albums ever that she lent me. Maybe just this one. But she lent me this album. And so this was a couple years after it already come out. And she was like, oh, I think you'll really like this album because you're into poetry and whatever, and I think you'll really like it. And I didn't know who A Perfect Circle was. I didn't have any music by Tool. I didn't know who Maynard was at all. I knew the name Tool. But at that point, I still don't think I had any songs. If I did have a song, it would have been Jerk Off, because I remember that I had a couple of burned CDs that I got just someone else to make for me that were mixed CDs, and I just had random songs on there that I was reading about in music magazines. And I remember having Jerk Off was the first Tool song, I believe, that I ever heard. Still one of my favorites, which is a common theme. The first album or the first song that I hear that I end up liking that artist, it ends up being one of my favorites. It's what got me into them, and it usually is a pretty strong song that hooked me, right? So, anyway, so it was a couple years after it came out that it was introduced to me, and it was probably 3 years after that, it was about 2006 or 2007, until the whole album hooked me. Because they lent me that album, I don't remember for how long I had it, maybe a week or so, but I just couldn't really get into it. So I had MER de Noms. I loved the artwork, so immediately I was like, oh wow, this is really, I mean, if you see the cover and with these symbols, and you're just what is, I don't even know, I don't know, especially at that time too. So you have to remember, this is the mid-2000s or early 2000s, I guess, where for me in my age, in my teens, because this was in high school, it was well, I had access to the internet, not at home, but through school. And it wasn't something that, I don't know, just think about what was there and what wasn't there. YouTube wasn't there. Social media really wasn't a thing yet. Not in the way that we know it now. I mean, not really inaccessible. Facebook or Instagram wasn't there. There was no Twitter, etc. So that just wasn't a thing. And finding music through the internet was not a thing yet, really. I don't even know when MySpace came along, but I don't remember it being that popular until mid-2000s-ish. And even then, the circles I was in just wasn't a big thing, or the scenes and the music that I was listening to, or just people. I know there's a whole bunch of bands that just got found on MySpace and whatever, but it just wasn't a thing for me. Anyway, so I saw this artwork and I was like, oh, this is kind of dark and mystical and I don't know what's going on. And I mean, the whole reason I bring up the age and access to internet and everything else is because one of the reasons this album is on here is because at that time, especially, it hit me in such a way because I'd never heard anything like it. I didn't really have a reference point for what is this? What is it? But at first that was detrimental. Well, not I shouldn't say it's detrimental. It just didn't hook me. I just wasn't ready for it. When it was introduced to me, I wasn't ready for it. The first song on the track listing is "The Hollow." That song I liked, and normally it'd be like, okay, like for just me as a person, generally I'm a fan of artists, and therefore, for the most part, if I like a song, I usually like that artist. And if I like that artist, I usually like 95% of their catalog. I mean, it's all ranked in different ways, but there's very few artists that I like where it's like, there's only a small handful of songs that I'll skip. There's a few exceptions to this, like Kiss. I like less than 50% of their catalog, but what I do like, I freaking love. But for the most part, if I like a band, I really like a band, or I really love that band, and just like I like the artist, the musical artist, and their discography, and the majority of it is something that I enjoy a lot. So anyway, this first song, "The Hollow," I mean, like it did hook me, and again, it has this like mystical, dark vibe, and I was like, man, I don't even know where to place this. So it did stand out, but for some reason, none of the other tracks did at that time. I don't know why, but none of the other tracks really left me with, like, I didn't want to listen to them. Like, I just I put the album on, and the thing was that at that time, also, I had way less in my life that was distracting me. I was way more spending my time just on the same things and focusing on those things, and part of that was just sitting in my room listening to music, listening to albums in their entirety, didn't put it on shuffle or random, I think it was called at the time on my CD player. I had a 3 tray CD player, listen to the albums just like from start to finish, and then I would go to the next one and then the next one, and the thing is that just wasn't a thing that happened with this album. I listened to it in its entirety, and it's a long time ago, but I guess I felt bored. Like, I just don't remember. I don't know, there were some albums, I had so few albums that they would grow on me eventually. Like, I remember when I first heard the debut Stone Sour album, that, Get Inside was very much Slipknot. And then you have Bother, which is like the opposite side of that, and everything else in the middle. It took some growing, and I love that album. It's a great freaking album. To me, it's Stone Sour's best album. But anyway, it took. I remember that album took a while to grow on me, and some other albums did too. The fact that this album is in my top 10, yet it didn't kind of come out to me right away and speak to me, is an anomaly, I think, on this list, and just for a lot of what I enjoy and love and the music I listen to now. And especially because now I don't have time to let an album grow on me, or I don't give it the time. I shouldn't say I don't have the time. I don't give it the time to grow on me. If it doesn't impress me pretty quickly, then it usually gets left in the dust, because there's so much music, and I have so much access to music, and even though I'm still paying for music and still buy music, and physical copies really only, unless the only option is digital, then I guess I'll do it. But the thing is that I have a lack of time, and before I had a huge amount of time, but also my priorities with my time are different as well. And so it's just, I don't know, it's just an anomaly, it's kind of weird. Didn't hook me. The Hollow did. I liked it. I listened to it multiple times. The rest of the album I just didn't click. And then years later, I don't know why. I mean, 13th Step would have been out at this time in 2006-ish. Man, I should have looked that up before. I'm not going to look it up now, but it should have been out then or soon after, because I remember, I don't know what happened exactly. I think what happened is that the Resident Evil soundtrack, Resident Evil Apocalypse, I believe it was, came out, and I got that soundtrack. And I believe Passive is on that soundtrack. There was another soundtrack at the time that had another A Perfect Circle song too. So I can't remember, but there was a remix of a song on that soundtrack. I believe it was Passive, and I was like, yo, like, I recognize this name, like A Perfect Circle, and I think that is what got me back into exploring these other tracks. Because, like I said, I ended up giving the album back, and I was like, yeah, it just really didn't do it for me, I don't know. And I was like, like I said, I was a little excited by the artwork and that song, The Hollow, but the other songs just didn't grab me, and part of it, yeah, it's just a time thing, really, I think. Like, just that time in my life, for some reason, it just didn't. I couldn't appreciate the subtleties of it, which we're going to get into. I couldn't appreciate the beauty of it. For some reason, the type of melodies on there and the type of softness on there just didn't grab me. This was also a time where it had only been a couple of years since I was into harder music, since I had my own taste of music. So, at this time in high school, for me, like, I had just, around age 14, I had been introduced to heavy music. That was the first time I was introduced to heavy music, and it was the first time that I really identified with music, and I wasn't just listening to stupid stuff that had a good beat or whatever, because a couple years before that, I was listening to, like, gangster rap, and I don't know why. It was just adjacent to some of the people around me, not in my everyday life, but the summers that I was spending in Toronto. So people had, like, really influenced my taste there, and also I just started reading the Source magazine and stuff. I don't know. But it was not something that I really identified with at all, and I didn't really have a strong connection to it, which is why it was so easy to drop. And so heavy music was introduced to me, and then that was like it. It was all consuming. And, that was also because I didn't have access. Like, there wasn't music on the internet like now where I can just, like, whatever. I only read the magazines that were, I started reading Hit Parader, and I didn't start reading Revolver till I think after high school, or maybe the last year of high school. Hit Parader and Circus, but that's because heavy music was introduced to me through a friend. I was like, hey, here is a couple albums, and Metallica's Black Album, the White Zombie, Astro Creep 2000, a couple Pantera albums, and Slipknot were like the first 5 or 6 albums that I got. And I was like, yo, and then they introduced me to grunge as well. But there wasn't really an avenue for me to keep exploring on my own other than reading the magazines. And so when I was reading the magazines, that's when I got someone else to make me some mix CDs, and then that kind of explored that way. But it was so slow. And the thing was that in those magazines, they were so targeted to metal bands. There wasn't a lot of other music, alternative music, or at that time like screamo, or as soon as, why can't I think of genres of music right now? Like metalcore, like, wasn't a thing, and then when it was a thing, like, I didn't have access to even knowing about it really at that time, or just, I don't know. There was just a lot. There's just certain bands they focused on in those magazines, and that is kind of what I had access to. If I had access or influence from other people at an earlier stage, I probably would have got into emo music and screamo, like, and I've mentioned this in the Watch Out, Alex on Fire album review, where to me screamo is a legitimate genre and whatever, and I know that it could be like post-hardcore is what they fit into anyway. So it's not belittling when I say it. Anyway, I didn't have many people influencing me in that direction. I would have got into that sooner too. I really didn't have anyone kind of giving me alternative music. And I think this person in high school also had the Tea Party's Interzone Mantras, and I believe they lent me that, and then I went and bought that. I think that's what happened. Or I discovered it on my own, but I think that they have that album, and that was another album they lent me. So that was the closest thing to any alternative music that I really was aware of. I didn't really have Smashing Pumpkins. I didn't really have whatever else now that I would consider alternative, like Placebo and stuff that I can't categorize, because I would categorize A Perfect Circle as alternative. Like, that's just where I would put them if I have to give them a genre. So, I just didn't have access to a lot of stuff. And it's not that it was so different that's why I couldn't grasp it. I just wasn't ready for it. And I don't know why I wasn't ready for it, but I just wasn't. Until a couple years later. Again, a couple years later, about 2006, 2007, Resident Evil Apocalypse. It might have been 2005, but I think it was 2006 or 2007. I got the soundtrack for Resident Evil Apocalypse. There was a lot of stuff on there that I really, really loved. And this remix of Passive that I believed to be on there, which I didn't double check before I started this, was on there. It triggered me into being like, you know what, I need to explore Perfect Circle again, because I remember that so-and-so lent me this album, and whatever. So then I went back. And this is why I'm saying I also believe that the stuff I should have freaking researched, but I haven't done an album review in so long. I wrote my notes, but I didn't do enough research. 13th Step must have come out around that time, because I remember being like, oh, this is the album, MER DE NOMS, that they lent me or whatever, and also I remember very quickly 13th Step was around then as well. And I remember the differences that I thought of the albums, but also to me they were so similar. Unlike, those two albums And then if you want to compare that to Eat the Elephant, that's a whole... It's like they're two different bands, in my opinion, the majority of time. And I know that we've got like a covers album in between there, which is a motive. But anyway, to get back into this, to get really in detail with this. So, The Hollow, I remember liking that song. I remember listening to it again. I remember enjoying it. Passive. It would have had to have... What am I thinking? Of course 13th Step was out by then, because it's all, Passive is off of 13th Step. Idiot. Okay, anyway, now that I've established more confidence in my timeline, so yes, I explored that album, I re-explored MER DE NOMS, I enjoyed them a lot, I really, really liked them. I had been exposed to more music at that time, I had more of a sense of what I liked, I was open more, and that's kind of what I was saying before. I was exposed to heavy music, and people around me that were influencing my musical tastes were really into heavy music, and some of them were into some really offbeat stuff that introduced me to really offbeat stuff, but I wasn't ready for the majority of it then either, and so I was really much such just like a metalhead at the time that there was very few things that people exposed me to that I liked, and also I just wasn't getting a lot of exposure to different genres. It only started opening up like when I was graduating high school, and then after that opened up more and more and more, and this was a perfect opportunity, I guess, when I was a little more open, that a perfect circle just got me, and I got it. And I mean, things that were going on in my life too. I think that's another reason, is like I can relate to this music now. Before, certain songs gave me a feeling, a vibe, but I don't know what it was that it wasn't catching. There was a lot of beauty in that music, but there was so much subtlety, and the aggression was subtle. The bite that it had was so subtle that I couldn't pick up on it at the time, because to me it was like, oh, Slipknot is over here, and all these other bands that are heavy, that are aggressive, that are whatever, and it was so obvious. I mean, it was like a kick to the teeth with, steel-toe boots on, that it was just so obvious that for some reason I just couldn't appreciate subtlety. Maturity was part of it, exposure to music, not being like a real connoisseur of music at that time, not like I'm implying that I am now, but just not having as much exposure and knowledge and taste of my own yet, and still growing that at that time, which to me is like late. But yeah, I couldn't appreciate the subtleties. A couple years later, I could. And I want to get into a couple tracks here. So, there's something in this album that still at that time, in my youth, in my late teens, early 20s, I was very still in a mode of dramatics in a way that I'm not now. It's probably still relevant now, but it's just different. And now it's more, I feel nostalgia for those things. But there's a desperation that was there in my youth as well. And in this album, there is a desperation, a romantic desperation, a dark desperation, a dramatic desperation that rings in a lot of these tracks. So The Hollow is there. I've already talked about, that was the first song that kind of hooked me. It was a very sexy song. It was a very dark song. It was poetic. Maynard's writing and stuff, I wasn't used to it. I don't know. And the singing, everything about the musicality of it as well was just so different to me. And that's not the reason why I didn't like it. At the time, I just couldn't appreciate it. I didn't get it. But there is this desperation in there. And to me, at that time, it hit me in a very, it's a romantic thing to be desperate, to be vulnerable, to express that. There's just this romanticism there. And so in tracks like Orestes, if I'm saying it right, I probably should have looked at the pronunciation of that. Three Libras, that is also there. I mean, even in Rose and Sleeping Beauty, there's a beauty there. To me, it's a more innocent beauty, but there is this subtle darkness in some of these tracks, and then some of the other tracks, this darkness kind of flares up more. And this beauty and this darkness and stuff is something that that's the thing. The person who lent me the album was probably really perceptive to the fact that I should have enjoyed it. For some reason, I couldn't hook into it. But I should have been, because that's exactly, I think, what I, in those years, that is something that I was into. But for some reason, it wasn't just in this very particular vein. It just didn't hit me. And a couple years later, it was 100%. What I could get into and what I had been into in a way, what I was feeling, what I was writing about myself, how I was expressing and how I was processing my own feelings at the time. There's a term that I believe Davey Havoc of AFI used, and that's where I got this term from, probably from reading Circus or Hit Parader or whatever he was in, or maybe it was Revolver when I started reading that. Romanticism and darkness. I really believe that's where that term originated for me. That was the first time I'd heard that term used, and it's a term I continue to use to this day. And to be early about it, this album exemplifies that term. And that term is still very important to me today, and it's still, it explains to me in those three words, romanticism and darkness explains me as a person, my art, what I enjoy, what I'm influenced by, what I express, how I process things around me, what I feel as a person, what I appreciate in art, whether it's music, movies, books, whatever, visual arts. That is just something that really defines part of my nature and my being. So this album exemplifies that. That is why it is on this list. And I said that's going to be early because, it just happened to be there, so I took it. But another one of these tracks that is the strongest track on here for me as someone who's identifying with the music is Magdalena. It's not a good thing to identify with this track. Not at all. It is something that, in that time, like I said, late teens, early 20s, this song came back to me over and over and over again after that. My mid-20s, my late 20s, it kept coming back. Which is why I have such a strong tie to this album still. It's not because all these songs I just identify with and whatever, because there's other songs I identify with on here too. But Magdalena, if you know the song, then I don't have to explain much else to you. If you don't know the song, I'm going to have to unpack this a bit, right? Is that this song was, for me, really about one of my negative coping mechanisms. And that was, it's sometimes, obviously a negative coping mechanism is kind of an abuse of self. And that is this particular way, this disrespect for myself, the using of myself, the romanticizing and putting on a pedestal of someone else, all this stuff played together, and it was something that was it was a habit. A negative coping mechanism becomes usually a habit and something that's very difficult to break. And this was the hardest thing for me to break out of anything. Having this really negative relationship with others and myself at the same time, and falling into a loop where I'm like, that's the problem, is that this what do I call it other than just repeating, this vicious cycle, whatever, it was romanticized in my head so often, even though the outcome of it was negative so much of the time. It was like chasing the dragon. It was me, in the song, throwing my dollar down, me disrespecting myself, having no confidence, all these things. And there were times in my life that I recognized towards, my mid-20s and late 20s and whatever, that, this is not the way to be. I'm recognizing with that song, at first, the first couple times I heard it and loved it, it was, I understood it, but I didn't understand it the same way, because my experiences weren't the same. And, I understood it, I romanticized it way more earlier on. And later on, I recognized I am romanticizing this and that's not a good thing. But originally, I wasn't thinking, this is a bad thing. I was just thinking of all the other beautiful parts of the song, and the fact that, yes, I would put women on a pedestal, and, in the process, really abuse myself and really put myself in negative positions and think less of myself afterwards, etc. So that song is still super, super strong, and I can't really listen to it that much anymore. It doesn't put me in a sad place, when I've talked about, Mechanical Animals, that album, it's the most depressing album ever. I can't really listen to half the songs on there because I listened to them so much when I was in such a dark place. This is a dark place, but it wasn't as concentrated, and it evolved over time. And I just don't really listen to it because it doesn't give me a nice feeling. It makes me remember, that these things were priorities to me that were horrible priorities, that the way that I treated myself wasn't great, that the way I treated others wasn't great, that this is just a reminder of a period of time that spanned for so long where I don't really need that reminder. I feel like I moved beyond it. However, this is such a strong tie for me to this album. None of the other songs speak to me in the same way that this song does. But the other songs are beautiful. So to kind of go back to me talking in generalities about things, I mentioned this subtlety that I could not appreciate at the time I was introduced to the album, which is only a couple years after it came out. There is aggression on this album. Despite all the dark beauty that is expressed through, Billy's instrumentation and his orchestration, I guess, of everything, Maynard comes in with beauty that, and his vocal patterning, obviously his voice, his lyrics, everything else. I mean, I think Billy's got lyrics on there too. Again, research I could have done before, but I mean, he's really orchestrating this band and pushing it and driving it forward more than Maynard is. Giving it, a direction. Anyway, there's these subtleties on there. There is aggression on there. Judith is the most biting track on here. I think it's the most obviously aggressive song on here by the delivery of it, by its lyrical content, by how forward some of the lyrics are. But there are other moments where I would say that the tracks have an aggressive edge that's tongue-in-cheek, but with a razor hiding right behind the teeth. Like, it's smart, because it's not having to hit you over the head with it. But it's there, and it's... I don't want to say it's humorous, but it's got a wit to it with the bite. And again, this tongue-in-cheekness that's there. I think that's way more obvious on 13th Step. I think the aggression on 13th Step becomes, in some places like Passive, more obvious and less subtle, but still beautiful. And a lot of those tracks end up having this subtle aggression, Blue and other tracks on there too, which I'm not talking about that album, but I'm just saying it started here. This is the debut album. This is where that stuff started. There is some slight aggression, and there's subtlety in that. I believe that the beauty of the album is what spoke to me first, and it was obvious that it was beautiful, but again, at the time, I couldn't appreciate that beauty, because all I heard was like, on tracks like Rose or Sleeping Beauty and stuff like that, I was like, this is supposed to be really pretty, and I don't really feel like listening to that. I didn't even appreciate the darkness that was there in these albums. Like, there's a mysticism, that's kind of there in some of these songs, like with just the instrumentation, and I kind of got some of that, but I didn't equate that to a darkness that I could comprehend or anything, I guess, that I was comprehending or appreciating and relating to in those moments. But again, a couple years later, there I am, and this album is still super important to me. Not just because it's the debut album, like I think that I would listen to 13th Step more often than I do MER DE NOMS, but it is still a beautiful album. It's still all killer, no filler. Like, there's still, like, every song on there I can listen to. Magdalena, because it is so strong, this is something that's come up in, I think, almost every single album that I reviewed, or that out of, the 8 before this, that there are songs or albums that are so strong that I can't listen to them anymore or whatever, because they completely mark a time in my life or a period or a feeling or an event or whatever else, that it is so strong, it does its job. And I compared this to, like Pain Demands to Be Felt, and so like I will skip that track. Not because it sucks, but quite the opposite. So, this whole album I'm very comfortable listening to. Other than Magdalena, it makes me uncomfortable. Not because it's not something I haven't faced. I've already resolved that issue, and therefore I'm like, I feel like I don't need to be brought back there. I feel like it took me a long time to resolve those issues, but I did. Anyway, again, this album exemplifies romanticism and darkness. That is why it is on this list. That's why it is so important to me. This was still a period in my life where there was a lot of evolving, a lot of changing, but I wasn't recognizing it as change. But these are still formative years. It's still me trying to figure out who I am. I'm always going to be trying to figure out who I am, and I think that, formative years and whatever, you could use that title and definition in a bunch of different ways to mean different things. But, late teens, early 20s, I still don't know who the heck I am. That's really all I can think of to say. about MER DE NOMS. It's just it's a beautiful, dark album that has subtleties of aggression, and I don't know how to explain the beauty in the album. Some of it I think is too obvious, and that's why I didn't latch onto it at first. The other stuff it's not hidden. It's just, to me, it's plain. It's just there. But I've come to appreciate that type of beauty. I've come to understand that this dark cloud, it's not a dark cloud. It's just overused. It's just a stupid thing to say. I don't know how to explain it. It's something I don't have visuals for right now. But I don't know. It's just it's a very artistic album. Is the other thing. It's a very poetic, artistic, creative. Well, I shouldn't use the word creative either. It's just got so much in there. It's rich. It is rich. It is not one-dimensional, and it is not just one thing. And the lyrical content isn't just one thing. I mentioned a common thread of desperation that I feel throughout the album, but that is expressed in different ways. And I think some of that desperation is angering. Like with Magdalena, like I don't feel anger in the song. I feel anger now. I feel anger like processing how I was then. But originally, like, so when I heard that song, I wasn't getting the fact that Maynard was maybe upset about anything. But there's a desperation there, I think probably exemplified there, that I identify with more than any other track. But I mean, it's there. That is a common theme, I believe, that runs through the album. Also, that this is a romantic album. This is something. But what are we romanticizing? It's not just love. It's not that. It is a love of what? Of being able to understand darkness in your life, being able to understand and comprehend and live with and sit with these uncomfortable feelings. And I think some of these songs are criticisms of maybe other people as well, and that's something that's on there with kind of that more biting aggression that is somewhat subtle. So it's still a complex, rich album, but again, it's unified. It's unified musically. It's unified thematically. It's just it's not. I have a hard time saying anything's a perfect album, but this is just. It's a fantastic, magnificent, amazing album, and it still means a lot to me because it got me into a perfect circle, and this album and 13th Step are just really rich albums that I paint to still. That I create art because with this as the soundtrack, because it still gives me so much. It is still rich. It still sets a mood, and again, it's a complex mood, but it is somewhat dark and romantic, and sometimes a sexy mood, and sometimes an aggressive mood, and all that stuff kind of mixes together into this album. And same thing with 13th Step, and what for a long time this band exemplified for me, and what I saw them as a symbol of, until Eat the Elephant came along, and then it's a whole different thing. Anyway, I am hoping that I can actually finish this next week, and I am thinking that I can, and do an album review next week and have that out for you, and it will be the final installment that is there of the 10th album out of the top 10 albums that changed my life. So with that, I will see you on another time. Check out this album if you have not. Check out A Perfect Circle in general. This album and 13th Step. I would love to hear feedback on what other people think about this album and this band.